Okay, so I'm going to get started. And I know some of you. My name is Don Miller. I'm the Director of Church Engagement for Tear Fund Canada. And I am just back from Ethiopia. So, kind of living with the reality of everything that's happening right now in our world, living with the fear that's out there, living with the sense of like, what do we do and how do we best help? It was very interesting in Ethiopia. There were people that were actually selling masks on the street for $100. And when you put that into perspective, like $100 is so far beyond the means of an average person living in Ethiopia. And yet that's the reality of what people were asking for. And the other thing that I saw at the airport where there was a real sense of panic was people doing everything to cover their face. And, one of the things that I saw was somebody actually wearing an eye mask over their face. And so people were just trying to do whatever they could to protect themselves and to live with the reality of what's happening in our world. And what I would like to do for just a few moments this afternoon is just share with you a very brief PowerPoint of what we are doing at Tear Fund and how we are responding in the global south with the present reality of what's happening in our world. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen quickly, and hopefully everybody will be able to see this. And I'll just kind of jump right into what we want to talk about this afternoon. Basically, there's several areas that I want to cover this afternoon. One is I want to cover what Tear Fund is doing specifically in the global south, working with our partners to address the COVID-19 virus and how we are responding to that. The second thing that I want to address this afternoon is how we're leveraging our partnership with the Canadian Food Grains Bank and what we are doing in conjunction with them to leverage donations to go towards emergency response in the global south. And then the last thing I'll do this afternoon is share a link to some resources where you can go and you can see some of the things that are available to you as a church, including this specific PowerPoint. So if you want to be able to share this PowerPoint with your congregation, then that will be available to you, and you'll be able to do that. So the reality for us is at Tear Fund is we want to respond with radical love. I think it's very normal for us to feel anxious, to feel uncertain, and yet in the midst of all of that, we have the opportunity to respond with radical love. I think it's important for us to recognize that it's normal to feel anxious. It's normal to feel uncertain. But the great hope that we have is that God is in control. And, I, like many of you, have gone back to that scripture in Mark's gospel. It says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And, maybe that comes a little bit easier for us as we're thinking about the neighbors who are immediately around us here in Canada. And, I look across the street at my neighbors, the neighbors who are next to me, and it's easy for me to do that. But in the very same time, we're asked to love our neighbors who are at a distance from us. And those include people who are in the global south. One of the things that I've been trying to do is pay attention to the attitude of the church and the attitude of how people view the church. And, I love this quote that's on the slide in front of you. Historically, Christians have been the first to rush in and last to leave in times of crisis. I especially think of that being true in some of the areas that we work, and especially in relationship to maybe the Ebola crisis. And we heard over and over again from the areas that we were working in response to the Ebola crisis, that was true, that the church was the first one to come in to help, and the church was the last one to leave when everybody else had disappeared. And so, there's great opportunity for the church to respond in this time and to respond as the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. I, like many of you, really believe that as the church, we are all a part of something much bigger than the expression of the local church in your community. And I hope this afternoon that you get a sense that, yeah, we're also part of the global church. 2 weeks ago, I was in a city in southern Ethiopia. The congregation that I was worshiping with that morning was about 3,000 strong, and it was Kids Day. And just like you would be doing Kids Day in your congregation, they had kids reciting memory verses. They had a beautiful choir of about 150 kids at the front leading us in worship. And so it's just a great expression. And so you and I are part of something much bigger. The other reality that I think about for the church is that we were made for this time. You know, being an organic organization, we are uniquely positioned to respond as the hands and feet of Jesus. We're made for this. Followers of Jesus Christ are equipped for this. And so the question is, how do we respond, or are we going to respond? And then another thing that I've kind of heard surfacing in several conversations is the thought that Christians don't do normal. You know, sometimes we like to be in that place where everything's understood, but really the story from Scripture is a story of not doing normal. And so how do we really embrace that and say, yeah, we're not going to do normal in times like this? As I think about some of the people that we want to be responding and speaking into, I think about this young orphan called Alusaline. And Alusaline, he lives in a remote part of Liberia. My colleague Wayne just met Alusaline last year, 11 years old. Unfortunately, both of his parents were killed by the Ebola virus. 2 siblings were killed by the Ebola virus. They live in a Muslim village of 27 neighbors. And as Wayne was in Alusaline's village, he said that every second house had lost a loved one to Ebola. And so Alusaline was taken in by a neighbor. He lives now in a family of 8. And as we think about that family of 8, how are they going to deal with the coronavirus? What's that going to look like? They live in a situation where there's no soap, no hospitals, no doctors, no prevention training at all available anywhere near them. And so what will happen if COVID-19 hits here? What's it going to look like for this young boy and the neighbors that have taken him in? And so how do we respond into that? And that's one of the questions that Tear Fund Canada is really kind of trying to think about and kind of trying to digest. You know, at present time, as we look at the statistics, and if you're looking at like the John Hopkins map, it doesn't really look that drastic in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, the Kenya, 25 cases, Ethiopia, 12 cases, Tanzania, I think 12 cases. But the reality is that the cases are there. And as we've already seen here in Canada and in other places around the world, it doesn't take too long for those numbers to grow and explode. And so really what people are saying about sub-Saharan Africa is they're saying, prepare for the worst, prepare today. One of the authors that I heard talking about this, a data scientist at the University of Cape Town, he said, my concern is what we have here is a ticking time bomb. And so he's really talking about the data that he's seen to date and what does it look like as we begin to look at that data and extrapolate it out for the countries that we are working in. I think also about how the head of the World Health Organization spoke these words. In other countries, we have seen how the virus actually accelerates after a certain tipping point. So the best advice for Africa is to prepare for the worst and prepare today. It is actually better if these numbers are really true to cut it from the bud. And that is why we are saying we have to do the testing, we have to do the contract tracing, we have to do the isolation and cut it from the bud. I think Africa should wake up. I think my continent should wake up. And so, as many of you know, here is the reality for many places in Africa today. The reality is that people are living in crowded conditions in the poorest areas. For those of you who have been to Africa, you know that many people, maybe even in the village context, there's 8, 9, or 10 people that are living in a very small home. And then you begin to think about maybe the slums of Nairobi, and you think about thousands upon thousands of people who are jammed into small places. James, a resident of Kibera, an informal settlement in Nairobi, described the challenging situation in this way. Many people are cramped together in small spaces. A lack of water is the norm. So washing hands is another issue. Also here, people live hand to mouth. They have to go to work regardless of what symptoms are showing. And so that's the reality for most of the people who are living in these sub-Saharan African countries that we at Tear Fund are working in. The other reality is this: low-income workers cannot afford to self-isolate. You know, often we've heard this word self-isolate, and I know that when I came back from Ethiopia, that was the mandate for myself to self-isolate for 2 weeks. And so I've been living down in my basement while the rest of my family lives upstairs, and we're trying to do the best that we can during this situation. And, you know, we're coping, and we've got food in the house, and, you know, we're fine. But when people who are living in these African countries are told to self-isolate, that is so far from their reality of possibility. And so they can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to self-isolate. And then the other reality is that in most of the areas that we're working in, there's no easy access to any sort of masks. In many cases, there's no easy access to water. And in fact, you know, as I think about Ethiopia, many people are traveling an hour each way just to get their water. And so that's something that they do on a daily basis. There's absolutely no easy access to soap, and sanitizer is an unknown. And so that's the reality of what most of these people are working with. And so even when the local health officials come and ask people to self-isolate, that is so far from their reality. At Tear Fund Canada, we are aware that we cannot ignore the 1.3 billion people living in Africa, and they really have no way to escape the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's the reality for us at Tear Fund. We happen to believe that Tear Fund is perfectly placed in this situation. For the most part, we work through national church partners who represent national churches. And so some of these national church organizations represent thousands of churches. And as most of you will know, many of these churches are embedded in local communities. And through our work at Tear Fund Canada, working with our national partners, we are embedded in communities. The other reality I just mentioned, thousands of churches are ready to mobilize. Thousands of churches are ready to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ within their local context. At this present point, Tear Fund Canada has about 800 partner staff across multiple nations who are ready to respond in the areas that we particularly are working in. And if you want to know a little bit more about some of those countries that we are currently working in, you can go to our website at tearfund.ca, and you'll see some of that information, and some of that will be available there in terms of specifically what countries we are working in. Okay, so here's kind of the nuts and bolts of everything. What is our response together, and what does that look like? Well, first of all, our response is resourcing our partners with needed supplies. And so much like here in Canada, and we think about needed supplies, and we think some of those things that people have been, in a sense, hoarding, here are some of the needed supplies for our partners: masks and soap, sanitizer, and also posters or information pamphlets that can easily be given out as people think about how can they best respond. Secondly, our response includes training churches in proper hygiene practices. And so as people are either coming to the church where the church is going out in the community, our partners are going to be working with national churches to do proper training in terms of what does proper hygiene look like. Some of these things we can kind of think off the top of our head, and we think, oh, that's something that everybody should just naturally understand or be a part of. But the reality is that many people that are living in this context are willfully unaware of what proper hygiene practices look like. And then really our response together is equipping churches to be light in their communities. As I often like to remind people, the role of the local church is to carry out the Great Commission mandate. And so in this particular context, our role at Tear Fund Canada is to equip the church so they can do exactly what they are meant to do in light of what is happening in our world. And I think it's a great privilege that we have. I think it's a great responsibility that we have, but our role is to equip the church so they can do what they are called to do. And the beautiful thing about that is that people in these communities, then they relate to the local church. They relate to the ones that they have been working with. And so here's the present need that we are working with. I think we can agree together there's precious little time to avoid disaster in these sub-Saharan African countries. Tear Fund Canada needs to raise about $80,000 over the next week or so. And so we recognize that the challenge is huge, but there's a couple of things that I want to say about this challenge. As I mentioned earlier in the call, we are a part of something called the Canadian Food Grains Bank. And we're just so thrilled to announce that through the Canadian Food Grains Bank, we have a direct one-to-one match available on all funds that are given to Tear Fund to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so every dollar that's raised from individuals and every dollar that's raised from churches will be matched one-to-one through a matching program out of the Canadian Food Grains Bank. Many of you are also aware that a lot of these countries that we're living in, we have regular programming that's already happened. And we're just really thrilled to announce that just even this morning, we got confirmation that we are now allowed to take about 5% of the programming dollars that are normally invested in program and direct them over to allow our partners to use that money to get some of these resources that they're going to need. So, you know, investing in soap, investing in sanitizer. Just this morning, we got our first proposal back from the church in Liberia. And I noticed in that proposal that they're going to be purchasing buckets along with soap in their hand washing stations. And so they are already thinking through, how do we respond into this situation and what does that look like? And then of course, the huge need is for continued prayer. And we'd like to invite you and your churches to really continue to join us as we pray for the global church. And specifically, we're talking about the global church in sub-Saharan Africa. Would you be praying for these brothers and sisters in Christ? And would you be praying that they would be protected? Would you be praying that they would really be able to seize the opportunity to respond as Jesus Christ in this situation? Isn't it just beautiful that the reality is that the local church remains the hope of the world? And so through our partners, we're able to respond and we're able to be the hope in a very difficult time. Here's the reality, and I think I mentioned this earlier in the call. The church was made for such a time as this. The local church is the hope of the world, and we're extending an invitation today to those of you that are on the call to join us as we follow Jesus to where the need is truly the greatest. You know, I'm just sometimes just overwhelmed by the needs in our world. But I am truly overwhelmed by the fact that the need in most of these African countries really is the greatest that is out there. And so we have an opportunity then to respond in several different ways. First of all, thank you for being on the call this afternoon. And again, if you have any questions that you want to ask me specifically, put them in the Q&A button there on the Zoom call, and I'd be happy to respond to those. Here's 3 ways that we can respond. Number 1 is through your donations. And so you see the opportunity there on the screen for donations from churches to go specifically into emergency supplies for the national partners that we're working with. And so you can go to that website. Secondly, the opportunity is for prayer. And so we have actually created a list of prayer points specifically related to COVID-19 and working with our partners. And so you can go to that website that's there under prayer, and you can see the prayer points that are available for people as we think about how can we specifically pray? What does it look like to embrace prayer for a specific country? What are areas that might be places of concern that we didn't even think about, but we should be praying into those areas? And so you can go there to that site called Pray. And then lastly, we want to be resourcing churches. And so at Tear Fund Canada, we really see a huge part of our role simply being to resource the church here in Canada. As much as we want to resource the church overseas, we also want to be resourcing the church in Canada. And so you can go to that website called Equip. And there on that website, there's a number of different resources that you will find that can resource your local church and that you can use. First of all, you'll be able to find this particular PowerPoint presentation. So if you want to maybe share this as a part of your regular communication with your congregation, you can download this PowerPoint and perhaps share it with your congregation. Secondly, there's, we are in the season of Lent. And so we actually have several really good devotional guides available. One is specifically around Lent, but it can be used at any time. It's called Alive. And we've had some great feedback already on this particular resource. You can download the book for free, and you can send it out to your people if they have a little bit of extra time thinking about what to do as maybe they're staying home. Then this would be a great resource for them. Again, it's totally free, and you can send the resource out to your people. And then there's also a little bit of a longer devotional book there that's available for free. And you can send that out to your people as well, and they can engage with that. Some of you are looking for resources in terms of what to do in the small group context over this time. And we're so thankful for our friends in Tear Fund UK who have done a little bit of work around the book, When Helping Hurts. Some of you might know that book by Brian Fickard, and you can see on our website access to really short videos around that book that you can maybe use one a week for maybe even the next 6 or 7 weeks. Again, you can totally use it online, and it'll be a great resource to really begin to get people thinking about how do we best respond, what does that look like. There's also a link there if people want to download the book from Amazon, then they can, there's a very small purchase price on the downloadable book. And again, just a great resource that you can use for sending out to your small groups and having that available to you. If you're looking for other resources, we also have a number of other resources available on our regular tearfund.ca website. You can go there, you can scroll down to resources. There's a number of Bible studies available there. There's a number of resources around the issues of poverty, around the issues of mission. Some of the resources we've been able to use from our friends at Tear Fund UK. And so please go there and see those resources and really take advantage of those things, because we think that they are some great things that you can be using. So that is my very brief presentation to you on some of the things that are available to you. If anybody has any questions, I just really appreciate you asking the questions. And basically, if you don't have any questions, then We'll also be able to share this particular webinar as a recorded broadcast. And so if you are interested in that, you can send me an email at dmiller@tearfund.ca, and I'd be happy to share that with you as a recorded broadcast that you can share with other people. So if there aren't any questions, and you can just fire your question basically into the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. If there aren't any questions, then I just encourage you to go to the website, take advantage of the resources that are there, and help us get the word out and help us to be able to connect with churches as we think about resourcing people in the Global South. Any questions? Thanks, John Mark. Really appreciate that. Take advantage of the resources and appreciate your response to that. Okay, thank you very much, folks. So I'll be ending the call now. And thank you so much for being a part of this and for being with us on the call. God bless you, everyone.